On this Tuesday night, unjustified and unreasonable. The court ruling on the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act.
It was the right thing to do.
Ottawa's next move. The Israeli military's deadliest day in Gaza. How 21 soldiers were killed by their own explosives. Preparing for the next chapter in Canada-U.S. relations. What happens if Donald Trump wins again?
Mr. Trump represents a certain amount of unpredictability.
Plus, a pivotal vote, what could be the last chance to stop Trump from winning the Republican nomination. And the nominees are...
Where I see love, she sees a friend.
Ken gets the Oscar nod, but Barbie gets the cold shoulder.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with a court ruling related to an unprecedented event in Canadian history, the use of the Emergencies Act to shut down protests back in February of 2022. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government invoked the act to clear the streets of downtown Ottawa. For almost a month, they'd been taken over by so-called Freedom Convoy protesters who had also blockaded some border crossings. Well, today, Canada's federal court ruled using the act was unreasonable and unjustified, contradicting an earlier public inquiry that found the government had acted appropriately. David Akin breaks down what it means in our top story tonight.
The convoy protests had been in Ottawa for 3 weeks, and border crossings in 4 provinces were being disrupted. That's when the federal cabinet invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time. In doing so, it gave law enforcement agencies extraordinary powers to end the protests. But in the first court ruling of its kind, Justice John Mosley sided with civil liberties groups who argued the government failed to meet a key test before invoking the act.
Justice Mosley, in his decision today, finds that objectively the legal thresholds for invoking the Emergencies Act were not met.
The ruling comes with no financial awards or penalties. The plaintiffs simply sought a declaration that they were right and the government was wrong. The government, on the other hand, still thinks it's right, and it will appeal the decision.
We were convinced at the time, I was convinced at the time, it was the right thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do.
Another judge, Justice Paul Rouleau, agreed with the government, but Rouleau made his conclusion not in a court of law, but as a result of the Public Order Emergency Commission inquiry of late 2022. Rouleau believed there was a perceived threat to national security, and the federal cabinet is expected to reinforce that point in its appeal of Mosley's ruling.
Our national security, which includes our national economic security, was under threat.
Regardless of the appeal's success, the federal government had promised to update the Emergencies Act for an era of foreign interference and online threats. But the government has yet to make good on that promise. Donna.
David in Ottawa, thanks. Police in Edmonton say one man is in custody after shots were fired and a Molotov cocktail thrown inside Edmonton's City Hall. Global News cameras were rolling on a city council meeting at about 10 a.m. when it happened.
Manage our parks and river valley.
Let's have that conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Close the doors. Close the doors. The doors were locked. This surveillance video shows a man who police described as heavily armed walking into City Hall with a gun and opening fire. Police say it appears he was firing randomly and not targeting people. A police tactical team responded and later said there was no longer a threat to the public. No injuries have been reported, no charges have been laid, and an investigation is underway. Americans are watching voting in the New Hampshire primary tonight. Polls closed not long ago, and news outlets such as the Associated Press and NBC were quick to project former President Donald Trump as the winner, beating former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, setting Trump on the path to being the Republican presidential candidate. Jackson Proskow is keeping an eye on it in Concord, New Hampshire. Jackson, Trump has steamrolled over all his other rivals. Is Nikki Haley still in it?
Well, Donna, look, it's no surprise that Donald Trump won New Hampshire, but what is a surprise here is how narrow the margin is. Trump's team was projecting a 20 or 30-point spread here. It looks like it might only be single digits separating the only two major candidates left in the race. And that is good news for Nikki Haley, who is resisting any calls to drop out. And tonight she says she's in it to win it, pushing through to the next primary in her home state of South Carolina and through the campaign after that. She says she needs to stick around to give Republican voters some sort of alternative to Trump.
This race is far from over. There are dozens of states left to go. And the next one is my sweet state of South Carolina.
So, Jackson, she is still upbeat. But can you help Canadians understand why Donald Trump, who we know faces multiple legal battles, who constantly says false and misleading things, who attempted to overturn the results of the presidential election that he lost, why he has such a lock on the Republican Party?
Yeah, I know it doesn't make a lot of sense to people looking in from the outside, and any other candidate in Trump's predicament would probably be considered way too damaged for voters to even consider them. That is not Donald Trump, though. I mean, his lock on the party is rock solid. I was speaking with voters today who told me that they recognize that Nikki Haley is probably the better candidate to beat Joe Biden, but they just can't bring themselves to turn away from Donald Trump. In some sense, there's a cult of personality around Donald Trump that just seems to suck in everyone around him, even people who have their doubts. And I think, Donna, what we've seen here is that there is no sense that people are willing to turn on Trump. There is polling out there that suggests even if Trump is ultimately convicted of one of these multiple criminal offenses, that his supporters will still stand by him and even think he could run the country from behind bars.
Yeah, a lot to take in before November's presidential election. Jackson Proskow in Concord, New Hampshire tonight. Thanks. U.S. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris had their first joint appearance of the 2024 campaign season. They held an abortion rights rally in Virginia. Democrats are looking to make abortion a key election issue that they hope will galvanize their supporters after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Canada is also getting ready for the outcome of the U.S. presidential election and the possibility of another Trump presidency. Canada-U.S. relations were at the top of the agenda at the federal Liberal cabinet retreat. The Prime Minister announced a so-called Team Canada approach, tapping key ministers to work with Canada's ambassador to the U.S. and with business leaders to prepare for all possible outcomes. Abigail Beeman explains.
Cabinet on the road focused on U.S.-Canada relations.
It was more candid than I thought it would be.
Car industry executive Flavio Volpe was one of the experts on stage.
I think we're better prepared this time than we were before. We've shirked ourselves of the idea that you can check in when there's trouble. You should always be in contact.
Volpe referring to when President Donald Trump ripped up NAFTA. The renegotiations that followed strained Canada-U.S. relations, as well as the famous moment at the 2018 G7 hosted by Canada when Trump took off and tweeted Trudeau was weak and dishonest, then backed out of the final agreement.
Obviously, Mr. Trump represents a certain amount of unpredictability.
The Prime Minister announced a new Team Canada approach.
This is the team who's done that before, which should give a lot of confidence to folks watching.
There are literally millions of Canadians and Americans who interact together every day. We want to engage with them to understand what they're hearing and then, frankly, deploy Canadians to the U.S.
Justin Trudeau has now been in power long enough to work with 3 American presidents.
In the event of a second Donald Trump presidency, I hear you speak to your experience dealing with that administration, so I'm wondering, what would you do differently a second time around?
What worked best and what works with all American presidents is to demonstrate that what is good for Canada is also good for the United States.
But if that's the diplomatic message publicly, behind closed doors,
the Liberals are terrified, frightened of the idea of Trump winning the election.
While domestically, this poli-sci prof says Liberals comparing the Conservative leader to Donald Trump isn't new.
The difference is now the Republicans aren't who they used to be. They're now way out there on the moon somewhere under Trump.
We'll see just how far the Liberals take that comparison as they try to climb back in the polls. The retreat here now done. Liberals will meet with the broader caucus in Ottawa starting Wednesday before the House returns next week. Donna?
All right, Abigail in Montreal, thanks. It has been a terrible 24 hours in the Middle East. More than 24 Israeli soldiers have been killed in Gaza, along with almost 200 Palestinians, as the Israeli army continues its assault on the southern city of Han Yunis. There's been fierce fighting in that city, which is crowded with displaced people. The IDF says it has Han Yunis encircled now. Gaza's health ministry says at least 195 Palestinians, including women and children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. And the death toll since October 7th is now a staggering 25,400. Food is in such short supply, the UN estimates 500,000 Palestinians are facing catastrophic hunger. The head of the UN today called it collective punishment. Israeli soldiers are dying too, 21 of them in a single explosion inside Gaza. Daniele Hamamdjian is in Israel tonight with what we know about that. Danielle.
Donna, for Israelis, this was one of the darkest days since October 7th. Their soldiers killed by their own explosives. A funeral for one of 24 Israeli soldiers killed in a single day. Israel's bloodiest day in Gaza since the war began. All but 3 died in what the Prime Minister called a disaster, which is now being investigated by the Israeli military. The troops were in southern Gaza, 600 meters from the border. They were inside 2 buildings being prepared for demolition, where mines had been placed by soldiers. That's when a nearby Israeli tank was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, possibly triggering an explosion that caused the collapse of the buildings. We must learn the lessons and do everything for the peace of our soldiers, said Benjamin Netanyahu, who's under growing pressure at home to reach a deal that will secure the release of the hostages. Hamas is still holding more than 100 Israelis captive, some of whom have been killed, but their bodies have yet to be returned.
My Israeli government, who I do not feel is doing everything they can, shooting will not bring our hostages home alive. We need a deal. Whatever it takes, that's what needs to be done, and deal with our other problems later.
Hamas has reportedly rejected a deal proposed by Israel. On the table, an offer of a 2-month ceasefire in which hostages will be released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Hamas leaders would have been able to relocate to other countries, but they refused to leave. And today, Israel said it will not agree to any deal that sees Hamas remain in power. Donna.
Daniele Hamamdjian in Haifa, Israel. Thanks, Danielle. Russia is stepping up its missile attacks on Ukraine, this time hitting the capital, Kyiv, and the second largest city, Kharkiv. At least 7 people have been killed. A barrage of strikes damaged whole blocks of apartments in Kharkiv. Rescue workers searched the debris for survivors and found an 8-year-old girl alive. And in Kyiv, air raid sirens blared for more than 2.5 hours as apartment buildings were targeted. At least 22 people were injured across 3 districts there. The UN says today's bombardment appears to have been the heaviest since early January. NATO has signed a $1.2 billion contract to buy more artillery rounds to replenish the dwindling stocks of its member countries as they supply ammunition to Ukraine to help it defeat Russia. Delivery could take up to 36 months. And after months of delays, Turkey's parliament has approved Sweden's membership into NATO. The move clears the last big hurdle for Sweden to join the military alliance. Hungary is now set to become the only member state that hasn't approved Sweden joining. Prime Minister Viktor Orban says he has invited Sweden's leader to visit Hungary for negotiations. Iran has executed another person who was sentenced to death for participating in protests related to the death of Mahsa Amini. 23-year-old Mohammed Obadlu is the 9th protester to be executed. He was bipolar, and appeals to take his mental health into account during the trial were rejected. He was accused of killing a police officer and injuring 5 others by running them over with his car at a rally. Mass demonstrations erupted across Iran and around the world after Amini's death in September 2022. She was detained by Iran's so-called morality police, accused of wearing her hijab improperly. She later died in custody. Tragedy on a remote BC mountain. Coming up, what's hampering rescue and recovery efforts after a heli-skiing crash. The coroner's office in the Northwest Territories now says people have been killed in the crash of a passenger plane there this morning. It's not saying how many people or releasing any details until next of kin are notified. The plane reportedly lost contact shortly after takeoff near Fort Smith. That's about 740 kilometers south of Yellowknife. The Transportation Safety Board says the aircraft is registered to a company called Northwestern Air Lease Limited. It's capable of carrying 19 passengers, though there is no word on how many people were on board. The RCMP has sent in search and rescue teams. In BC, a heli-ski trip has turned tragic. 3 people were killed, 4 others badly injured when their helicopter went down yesterday afternoon. The RCMP says it crashed in remote terrain about 50 kilometers northwest of Terrace, BC. The aircraft was one of 3 helicopters on a backcountry ski trip. It was operated by Northern Escape Heli-Skiing. Cassidy Moscone explains what more we know.
In the remote mountain ranges of northern BC, tragedy.
3 helicopters were running a heli-skiing operation in the mountainous backcountry with numerous people on board each helicopter. Communication was lost with 1 helicopter and a crash site was located in a snowfield. There were 7 people on board this helicopter, and sadly 3 people did not survive.
Some 700 kilometres north of Vancouver, authorities in Terrace got the call Monday afternoon, then started the complex search for survivors.
The 2 other helicopters shuttled the remaining 4 passengers from the site where they were met by BC Ambulance Service, Terrace Fire Rescue, and taken to hospital. The injuries the victims had sustained were considered serious.
Through treacherous terrain and freezing rain, Tuesday's recovery mission of the bodies of 3 killed has been called off due to weather conditions. 2 survivors are in critical condition, 2 are in serious condition.
The 4 patients who were received at Mills Memorial Hospital following yesterday's tragic helicopter incident have been transported now further south in BC for higher levels of care.
Cassidy Moscone, Global News, Vancouver.
Still ahead, the lingering safety concerns 10 years after 32 people died in a Quebec seniors' home. A somber ceremony is being held tonight in the small community of L'Île Verte in eastern Quebec. It's to remember the 32 people who died when a fire ripped through a seniors' residence on a bitterly cold night. It happened 10 years ago. As Mike Armstrong reports, time has passed, but for the people who lived through it, the memories are vivid and painful.
Even though the plan was to rebuild almost from day one, it has taken 10 years. Construction is underway on a new seniors' residence for L'Île Verte after a decade of delays. It will be in the heart of the community on the same lot where the Résidence du Havre once stood until January 23rd, 2014. The fire started at 12:20 a.m. while residents were in bed. It spread quickly. 20 residents were able to be saved, but 32 were lost. We met Jean-Hugues Fraser in the days after the fire. His mother had called him from her room on the 2nd floor of the residence. Fraser went with a ladder, but couldn't save her. He told us he couldn't get what he had seen out of his head.
10
years later, Fraser says time has healed some wounds. Things hurt less. But that struggle with what he saw that night continues. Fraser says it's always there. When he closes his eyes in seconds, he sees it all again. The investigation into the fire found the residents had smoke alarms, but no sprinkler system. A coroner recommended all institutions with more than 9 people should be forced to put in sprinklers within 5 years. The government agreed, but has repeatedly pushed the deadline back. 169 of Quebec's 1,400 seniors' residences are still not in compliance, but still have until December. nearly 11 years after the fire. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And the nominees are next. A look at the Canadian talent up for an Oscar. Not everyone is ever happy when the Oscar nominations come out. Inevitably, someone feels snubbed, right? Well, let's start with who is happy.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world? Chances are near zero.
Oppenheimer, about building the atomic bomb, got 13 nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Supporting Actor and Actress. Director Christopher Nolan saying today he never imagined this level of success.
This is Bella.
Poor Things, about a young woman brought back to life, gets 11 nominations. Killers of the Flower Moon, just behind at 10.
Hey, Barbie. Can I come to your house tonight?
Sure. And Barbie, the movie that made the most money in 2023, gets 8 nominations, including Best Picture. But for a film that takes on the patriarchy, there were some glaring snubs. Director Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie, who played the lead role.
'Cause I'm just Ken, anywhere else I'd be 10.
Ken, however, did make the cut. Ryan Gosling is among the many Canadians being recognized this year. He's up for Best Supporting Actor.
The guy flew 13 hours to be here. I'm not going to tell you that you can't see him or something.
Competing with those Hollywood blockbusters, a debut from Canadian-Korean writer-director Celine Song. Past Lives, a love story partly based on Song's life, gets Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay nominations. And Canadian musician Robbie Robertson, who died last year, is nominated for Best Original Score in Killers of the Flower Moon. I like to think he'd be happy about that. That is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Humber Valley near Corner Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.